Thank you everyone for coming to yet another monthly edition of the University of Maryland's iSchool Socio-Technical Cybersecurity Lecture Series. Have fun saying that 5 times fast. It is my honored pleasure to introduce today Dr. Rebecca Slayton. She is an associate professor in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at Cornell University. Dr. Slayton's research and teaching examine relationships between and among risk, governance, and expertise with a focus on international security and cooperation since World War II. Some of her recent work includes 2 book projects supported by a 5-year NSF Career Award, Enacting Cybersecurity Expertise. Shadowing Cybersecurity examines the emergence of cybersecurity expertise through the interplay of innovation and repair. The other book, in progress, examines tensions intrinsic to the creation of a smart electrical power grid. Dr. Slayton received the United States Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers for her NSF Career Project. She was a AAAS Mass Media Science and Engineering Fellow and previously worked as a science journalist. Dr. Slayton earned her PhD in physical chemistry from Harvard University. And we welcome you today, Dr. Slayton, and look forward to your presentation. For a little housekeeping for everybody, I'm encouraging you all, please go ahead and use the chat. Introduce yourselves with your name and your institutions, and feel free to have conversations there as you like. But if you would like to pose questions for Dr. Slayton and her presentation, please put them in the Q&A and we'll address them all at the end. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm happy to be here. Looking forward to talking with everyone today. My presentation today will be brief because I'd much rather talk with people than talk at people. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, thanks everyone. So this is this title slide I use just to introduce the idea of computer security incident response teams. This map shows the members of FIRST, the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams, which has 562 teams in 97 different countries. And it gives you some sense of the distribution of these teams. So computer security incident response teams, also known as computer emergency response teams, they generally try to both prevent security breaches, and also to repair the damage after an attack, so to bring things back online. And there are actually many more teams than what you see on this map, because not all teams are actually members of FIRST. But this map gives you some sense of the distribution. It started in the United States, FIRST started, and the institution of computer emergency response teams started in the United States, and that's where most of the teams still are. But it's a very international space today. And part of what's interesting about looking at the international map is that it spans multiple countries that we often think of as adversaries. So for example, teams from China and Russia, as well as the United States and Western Europe. But it's all about facilitating cooperation on cybersecurity, sharing information. And that leads to some interesting questions about how and when these teams do work together or when they don't, because their governments are actually at odds over the particular incidents in question. So today I want to talk about how these teams have attempted to build a global infrastructure to coordinate operations so that they can collaborate better. And I'll start by saying a little bit about what I mean by infrastructure. So this image from the January 1994 cover of Popular Mechanics shows how one artist imagined the infrastructure behind what was then called the Information Superhighway in the early 1990s. That was the early name for the internet. And this artist imagined it as something like a highway system, but using fiber optic cables. It carried various kinds of information, entertainment, airline data, that sort of thing. And both the internet and highways are just examples of infrastructure. So there's a huge body of scholarship in infrastructure studies. And from that, we can get a sort of a general definition of infrastructure as intertwined technologies, organizations, and policies that enable information and goods to flow across space and time. So that's my working definition for infrastructure for this talk. If an infrastructure is working well, we generally don't even notice it, right? It's only when it breaks down that all of a sudden we notice it. And so people who study infrastructure are often interested in doing what's called infrastructural inversion, where you bring all of that invisible work happening beneath the surface to make the infrastructure work properly and make it visible. And that's part of what I'll be doing in this talk today. So is to try to make some of that invisible work more visible. So computer security incident response teams can be understood as having two different relationships to infrastructure. So first, their primary work is to actually maintain an information infrastructure, whether that's the internet, or sometimes these teams work on systems that are not supposed to be connected to the internet, but various computer networks. And they're charged with protecting and repairing those. But at the same time, they've also tried to develop a global infrastructure to help them with the work of maintenance. So they're developing one global infrastructure in order to maintain another global infrastructure. And that leads to the tension that I want to explore for today, and that I explore in a paper that was published in Technology and Culture last year, which is available online. So scholars in science and technology studies, which is my main field, have treated infrastructure as something that grows in scale and scope, whereas maintenance has generally been seen as something that is intrinsically local. So there's a tension between the notion of infrastructure as something that's global and expansive, and maintenance is something that happens at a particular point in locality. So as I suggested earlier, a working definition for infrastructure is that it's the intertwined technologies, organizations, and policies that enable information and goods to flow across space and time. And so this emphasis on flow highlights the sort of extending or mobilizing nature of infrastructure. That could span an organization or a city or a nation, or in this case, the world. That's the goal of a global incident response infrastructure. Whereas maintenance and has been seen as something that is more local. So historian David Edgerton writes that maintenance and repair are the realm of the small trader and skilled workers. They're different from, marginal to, and yet interdependent with the great systems of technics. So maintenance practices in geographically and economically distinct localities reflect inequalities. So what it is to maintain a car in the United States is very different from what it is to maintain it in a developing country in Africa, where you might expect your car to last a lot longer and do all kinds of things that you probably wouldn't do in the United States, because there's a different kind of economy of maintenance going on in those different regions. So this is the tension that I'm exploring between a global infrastructure for something that is traditionally thought of as being very local. And what I want to argue today is that while incident responders tried to develop an infrastructure that was truly global, that transcended geopolitical boundaries, in practice, infrastructure was somewhat fragmented. But I also want to argue that this is not because, or at least not solely because, maintenance has to be intrinsically local. And actually, I think you can make the argument that some kinds of incident response infrastructure have become global. So a simple example that many of us are familiar with, the big corporations that maintain our computers tend to push out patches every time something goes wrong. And although there are certainly systems around the world that are not part of that system, that's a pretty global system for continually maintaining computer software and operating systems. Rather, what I'm going to argue is that the reason that it was so difficult to make this infrastructure global was that it was fragmented by its reliance on local and regional trust networks, which in turn tend to be shaped by regional institutions and needs. So I'll go into this in more detail shortly, but it might help to sort of back up and think about why is trust so important in infrastructure, in a global incident response infrastructure. And if we go back to the very first incident that led to the establishment of the first CERT, you see that trust was a major problem from the very beginning. So in 1988, on November 2nd, 1988, the internet, which at that point was primarily a research and education network sponsored by the US Defense Department, experienced what one computer scientist called an attack from within. So the internet worm shut down much of the internet. And it exploited not only flaws in technology, but also the trust that was built into the network. So there were trusted host-user relationships that did not require passwords, for example. And that was a major feature that the worm exploited. So over the next 2 days after this started, computer scientists were working around the clock trying to stop this worm and get their computers back online. And they sent email, those who had email, or they called one another, and they were, occasionally wondering, is this software that somebody just sent me really a patch, or is it a virus? How do I know that the person I'm talking with is really at MIT and they're not the person who started this whole thing? And ultimately, interpersonal relationships triumphed over this breach of trust. So one reflection on this whole event argued that the old boy network worked. And there's all kinds of things we could say about gender here, which I'm happy to go into in Q&A. I won't go into it here. It was mostly men at this time, not solely though. And in any case, what computer scientists recognized was that what happened with the Morris worm was likely to happen again. So in anticipation of future attacks, they proposed the creation of a non-governmental organization, the Computer Emergency Response Team Coordinating Center, CERT-CC for short, that was housed at Carnegie Mellon University. It was federally funded, but it was not itself controlled by the US government. And trust was a really explicit part of the CERT mission. If you look at the initial founding documents, it appears again and again. So CERT was to provide a trusted 24-hour point of contact for emergencies. You needed trust to identify and correct vulnerabilities in computer systems and to adjudicate decisions about who you were going to disclose vulnerabilities to. So obviously, if there's a vulnerability that someone could exploit, you don't necessarily want to publish it so that all the hackers can quickly access that. So there were trust was needed to decide sort of how that was going to be managed. And then finally, trust was needed to coordinate and also develop a network of certs, because nobody ever thought that this one coordinating center was going to handle all the attacks that could possibly happen to all of the computers on, at this point, many different networks. The internet was not the only one. So in 1992, this coordination effort, this effort to sort of build out a whole network of incident response teams, became the Forum for Incident Response and Security Teams, or FIRST, which I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk. And as you can see from this initial list of FIRST members, most were initially US governmental teams. The CERT Coordinating Center in Pittsburgh, however, recognized that there was a need for a more international coordination, that the internet was not something that was going to be isolated to a particular country. And so they were actively trying to get teams around the world get started. And this was partly, there was a sense of, this is the right thing to do. There was a commitment to the technology. There's also a self-interested component here as well, because, US computers were being attacked by hackers in countries all over the world. And people wanted to know, well, who do we call? We want to have somebody in every single country that we know who to call and say, look, somebody in your country is up to no good. We need you to help us out. So there was a self-interested element to this as well, to trying to get this network off the ground. Okay. So CERT-CC was very involved in trying to build this network internationally. And they were very successful in increasing international representation. So this chart shows the growing internationalization of FIRST between the end of 1996 and then the end of 2010. I haven't taken it through to today, although you can go online and look at that map and see exactly what it looks like today. And I should note that while all teams list a primary country, many belong to multinational corporations, which operate in multiple countries around the world. So even this chart is a little bit misleading. What you can see is that while the US was, almost 75% of the membership of FIRST in 1996, the US is now, US teams are now a minority of members, although still the largest single country represented within this particular organization. But again, a lot of those teams still operate in a lot of the US teams actually have operations all over the world as well. So it's not solely confined to the US. Okay. So additionally, although FIRST was initially almost entirely governmental, commercial teams became much more common in the mid-1990s. And that was largely as a result of the rapid internationalization and commercialization of the internet in the mid-1990s. So by 1997, 40% of computer security incident response teams, or CERTs, that belonged to FIRST were commercial organizations. And as this chart shows, that number kept growing. So that by 2010, it's a majority. I believe it's still a majority today, although I haven't taken a recent inventory of it. And this was the context in which there's rapid internationalization and also rapid commercialization, that two of the early leaders in the field argued that, quote, a global response infrastructure was needed to replace a less reliable system based on trust between individuals with a reliable and effective system based on global understanding and agreement. And this came from a report they wrote in 1999 on building an international infrastructure for global security incident response. And they cited the response to the Melissa virus, which hit the internet on March 26, 1999. It spread worldwide faster than any previous virus to that point. And they said that is evidence of the need for more improved coordination. So the response to Melissa demonstrated a kind of nascent infrastructure, but it was very much centered on the US. CERT, the CERT Coordinating Center in Pittsburgh, received calls from all around the world, including the Netherlands, Sweden, Singapore, UK, Qatar, New Zealand, Canada. And many of them just took the US advisory, the CERT-CC advisory on Melissa, and posted it to their members in their home countries. But as authors of this report suggested, most of the global map was blank. So people were not necessarily really clued into what was happening or knowing how to connect to the CERT-CC center. And although CERT-CC continued to be treated as an authority and to help coordinate incident response worldwide, its coordination was really inadequate to meet the regional needs of many teams. So, for example, time zone differences were a major problem. The CERT Coordinating Center in Pittsburgh was just not going to respond as quickly when it was late at night in the United States, but still the workday in Europe or Asia or some other part of the world. So over the next decade, incident responders worked to develop several types of infrastructure. And in the interest of being brief, I'm just going to describe a few of these efforts at infrastructure development. I'll start by focusing on two regions. First, the development of incident response infrastructure in Europe, which eventually led to what is today called the Trusted Introducer, still around and very active. I should note that although this map that I'm showing here on the left portrays Europe primarily in terms of Western European country, the Trusted Introducer Network actually includes Eastern European and Russian nations, and Russia, so it's broader than just Western Europe. Excuse me. And then I'll contrast developments in Europe with those in the Asia Pacific region, which is shown here on the right. And that led to the establishment of a regional incident response team, or the Asia Pacific Computer Emergency Response Team, so AP-CERT for short. And then from there, I'll move on to discuss some efforts to develop infrastructure that would allow teams from both of these regions to work together, Asia Pacific, Europe, anywhere in the world to work together, and why those efforts still remain fragmented. Okay, so the CSERT infrastructure in Europe started at least by 1997 when they established EuroCERT, incident response teams there. And that was a basic incident response service for all of Europe. It ran from 1997 and 99. It was initiated by European teams in 1995. That's when they started developing it. And their goal was to maintain contact information for teams and channel information to appropriate teams whenever incidents crossed international borders. Not coincidentally, the European Research and Education Networking Organization, TERINA, funded it, but the teams disagreed on what EuroCERT should be doing. So, for example, for some, EuroCERT was simply a message coordinator. Others expected more active incident response work, and EuroCERT basically ended very abruptly in mid-September 1999. The person who was in charge of running it got another job offer, I think, from Cisco, and that was that. It ended. But they still knew that they needed some way to coordinate. And so about a week later, after it ended, leaders of several teams met in Amsterdam to discuss other ways of working together. And they agreed that they should abandon the idea of a European incident response service because they had such different needs and they couldn't agree on what their common goal for this response service was. But with the support of TERINA, they formed a Task Force CSERT, or TFCSERT. And also with the support of TERINA, they established a credentialing service. So this is the Trusted Introducer to enable, quote, a trusted relationship between new certs and the established cert network. So to help new teams get involved, for people to know who they could trust, what new teams they could trust. Okay, so things evolved in parallel lines in the Asia Pacific region. In 2003, there was the formation of the Asia Pacific CERT and AP CERT. This was again initiated by leading incident response teams, not by governments. Some were non-governmental, but most of them were non-governmental. Some were governmental, so Korea was a governmental incident response teams. But they did have the support of regional organizations. So for example, the Asia Pacific Networking Group, or the Asia and the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Group as well. And it initially included about 15 teams across 12 different economies. And they also quite explicitly modeled their effort at credentialing new members on the European Trusted Introducer Service. But they also acknowledged that what they were doing was different than what was happening in Europe because, quote, the Asia Pacific region is unique for its wide economical gap and complicated security policy gap. So in a nutshell, some countries and some teams in the Asia Pacific region are very wealthy. They're coming from very wealthy countries. Others are coming from very poor countries. Some of them have a lot of expertise in security, others really don't. And so, for example, unlike the Trusted Introducer Service, where you actually had to pay dues to be credentialed and join the service, there was none of that in the Asia Pacific. It was just a different model. But there was still the recognition that they needed someone to sort of broker this trust relationship. And that where you used to have these interpersonal relationships, now you need to have some kind of infrastructure. And you basically put your trust in the infrastructure instead of the interpersonal relationships. And that's where the title of this paper and talk come from. Another difference is that unlike the TF-CSERT model, which abandoned operational incident response, AP-CERT was active and continues to be active operationally. And that's partly because there's a sense of a need to do more coordination in an area where there's substantial language differences, for example, and also, again, substantial differences in terms of the security capabilities of different teams in different countries. And a lot of the AP-CERT's activities are government funded, even though the initiative and control really remains with these quasi non-governmental actors, the incident response teams themselves. Okay, so it was great to have these two regional networks, but there was also the recognition from the very beginning that you couldn't constrict things to just regions, that this was a global system and there needed to be global cooperation. So one of the things the incident response teams worked on very early was an infrastructure for exchanging incident data. So at the time, in the early 1990s, exchanging data was very slow, it was very labor intensive. This was partly because there was no standardized way of describing incidents, so multiple teams could report on the same problems and they didn't know they were actually talking about the same thing. It was also because of the need for trust between teams sharing information. So you didn't just want to blast out to the whole world that you had an incident, you wanted to be very careful about how you revealed information. And this, of course, was a huge problem when attacks are moving very quickly around the world. So in 2000, leaders in the European incident response community organized a working group to develop a standard called the Incident Object Data Exchange Format. And they developed an associated software application to exchange information about incidents. And initially this was supported by TERINA, the European Networking Organization. And to gain TERINA support, interestingly, they advanced a kind of parochial argument that, quote, the successful implementation of the IODEF will contribute to TERINA and TF-CSERT recognition in Europe and worldwide, and that this project was, quote, a first Europe initiative in an area where all previous attempts have been US-based. So it started very much as kind of a European identity identified initiative. But by 2002, the standard development was moved entirely to the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF. And the Europeans had worked with the IETF from the very beginning because they wanted to be able to use the standard globally, but they also recognized by the early 2000s Tarina did not want to continue supporting this thing because it was consuming a lot of resources, and it was seen as something that went beyond Europe, which of course was the goal. They didn't want it to just be about information exchange within Europe. So moving standard development to the Internet Engineering Task Force was good from the perspective of creating a global infrastructure, something that went beyond Europe, but it also complicated the final standard and it made it too flexible. So as more stakeholders from around the world became involved, more and more features came to be included in IODEF. And that might seem like a good thing, like why not just add more features? It makes everybody happy. But what that meant was that there was you could use it in 10 different ways. And one incident responder noted that IODEF has so many possibilities and options that I could define my mother-in-law using IODEF. So again, flexibility might sound good, but it meant that organizations that wanted to share data with each other, they had to actually enter into an agreement on how they were going to use this very complex protocol before they could share data. And that's one reason that the Europeans who started developing this grew quite disillusioned with IODEF. By the time it was finally published, it became an internet standard in December of 2007, so more than a decade after it had, well, close to a decade after it had started. And additionally, China and Japan needed language extensions, so that complicated the development as well. And so the result of all this was that despite the fact that this was a global standard, one that the Internet Engineering Task Force had published, in practice, there are many different implementations of this protocol in use, and they correspond to different agreements about how to use it. So that people know what field you go to when you want to find a particular kind of information. It's because those fields can be used for different kinds of information, and the same information could be in different fields. There have to be agreements worked out in advance. And so today, most incident response data sharing and exchange continues to be pretty slow and based on trusted relationships between partners. So this infrastructure, this was not something where people could just trust the infrastructure to work. They had to maintain those trust relationships between partners in order to exchange data. Okay. So wrapping up, I'll just restate the argument briefly, that efforts to develop a global infrastructure for incident response were driven by a transnational community, but the reliance of that community on regional institutions coupled with regionally specific needs ultimately fragmented the infrastructure, and it limited the scope of transnational cooperation on cybersecurity. So I would love to hear comments and talk more about this work. I should say I'm not done with my research on incident response infrastructure. I'm currently, this paper and this talk was oriented towards sort of a history of technology audience. And I'm currently working on a paper that's more oriented towards the international relations community. I do want to briefly acknowledge my co-author on this paper, Brian Clark, who's now an archivist in Canada, at the Canadian National Archives. Many people also participated in interviews, shared documents without which we wouldn't have had this story to tell. And of course, this research was supported by the National Science Foundation. So with that, should I stop share at this point, Sean? How would you like to proceed? I'm not hearing you. Can you unmute?
Sorry, I had to unmute. I was gonna say, yeah, if you want, you can stop share and
Okay.
we'll address some of the questions that are coming up. And if people want to address specific slides, we can bring them back up and go through as we need to.
Great, thanks.
So thank you for the great talk. We have a couple questions already starting to come in. And again, everybody listening in, please go ahead and submit additional questions to the Q&A. We can address them here. So one of the first questions asks, why and why not will CERTs want to cooperate at the global level?
Why and why not?
Sure, if you could maybe speak to both.
Yeah, so I mean, the reason why is that they know that the same incidents that hit somebody in, Japan could hit somebody in Africa, could hit somebody in North America, and they want to get on top of that before it hits them. So learning from what happened to other people is really, really useful if you're an incident response team. So that's the major reason for wanting to share information globally. The reason not to is that you may not trust everybody in the world, right? I mean, this is inherently an adversarial space. The problem is that you are potentially being attacked at any point by other actors that you don't trust. So I don't know if that answered the question, but those are sort of the two fundamental things in tension. And reason why there's this need for sort of interpersonal relationships to broker that kind of cooperation.
Great. So continuing on the international theme, and again, you said this was, your presentation was more towards the history of technology, but you're still working on one with the international perspective here. So there's another international question that asks, how is authority distributed and governed in these international organizations? Who's calling the shots, setting the agenda?
That's a good question. I mean, in principle, it's supposed to be sort of a bottom-up kind of arrangement. I think first is fairly decentralized. I mean, there is, you know, an executive sort of body, but mostly what they do is just organize meetings and invite people to give talks. So a lot of it is, it's very bilateral and very decentralized. So people sort of choose who they want to cooperate with and not. I'll also say one of the interesting, when I was asking people about tensions in this community, they said that they had less overt conflict and more just decisions about who they would cooperate with. So it wouldn't be so much that the US CERT or a US organization would say, oh, I'm never going to cooperate with the Russian CERT. And then many times they would. It would be more that there might be instances where they just decided not to, whereas they had more established relationships with other teams. Some of these teams have explicit relationships so that are about geopolitical rivalries. So for example, China, Korea, Japan. 3 countries where there have historically been a lot of rivalries and tensions and patriotic hacking crossing over borders. And these teams have sort of explicitly agreed to work with one another, but it's very decentralized. So there's not the sense that, you know, that there's one body on top calling the shots. Governments are also trying to manipulate these teams sometimes. So they can't necessarily do that in the private, they can't do it as much in the private sector. So you see interesting things where, for example, Kaspersky has which is a Russian cybersecurity firm, has an incident response team, and that has reported on malware that most of the world thinks actually came from the Russian government. And they won't say, oh, our government produced this and is culpable, so that they won't get that political. But they're still kind of in this space where they're willing to, you know, do things that their government might not really want them to do. On the other hand, maybe their government says, no, that gives us more credibility, right? Anyway, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but it's very decentralized. There's a lot of different actors with a lot of different politics going on between them.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good segue to a couple questions we have about trust specifically here. So one of them asks, any thoughts on the relationship between trust and dependence? More provocatively, did Europe free ride on the operational capacities in the US?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't think that anybody saw it as free riding, because for one thing, the US was putting it out there. If anything, I think it would have been more the opposite, that the Europeans would be like, back off with your cultural imperialism. Except there wasn't so much of that, right? Because it was like, we recognize that there's all this technology in the US, and there was, as you saw in one of the quotes that I provided, the sense that, hey, but we Europeans, we're doing really good stuff too, and we want recognition for it. But the cooperation was there from the very beginning. So for example, the 1999 report that I cited that talked about needing to develop a global infrastructure for incident response, that report was published, co-authored by Peter Klaus Kostiakowski, who was German, and a leader in incident response in the United States in Pittsburgh at the Computer Emergency Response Team Coordinating Center. And so they were very much interested in working together, and the US kind of recognized that they needed buy-in from the Europeans. They needed to understand that context in which people were operating if they were going to come up with sort of best practices and guidelines, which is part of the infrastructure that they were producing, was trying to help new teams get started. They needed sort of a set of like, here's some basic things you need to do if you want to be an incident response team, and to put those out there in a way that was quasi-authoritative. I mean, they didn't have any formal authority, but if they were recognized as good at this kind of activities, then people would be likely to adopt it. So I mean, you could argue that it was free riding, except that they were kind of invited to free ride, right? They were being asked, like, you know, yes, please take our work and use it because we think and for a self-interested reason, because people in the US knew that if they didn't have the buy-in and the cooperation of people in Europe, they could be attacked. And you know, US networks were attacked by hackers in the Netherlands and Germany and other places. So.
Great, thank you. And continuing on the trust aspect, Ed asks, has your or others' research looked at the role of incident postmortems by corporate platforms like Amazon Web Services or Slack platform with respect to trust? And if you want for later, there is a link to Slack engineering post.
Oh, that's interesting. I have not looked at that. I'd be interested to know, did somebody want to elaborate more on that particular issue?
Ed, you asked this question. Can we enable, Sarah, if you're still here, can we enable Ed's audio? We might have to circle back on that.
Okay, I'd be interested
because of the web. Yeah,
because what Ed thinks we should investigate specifically. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Ed, I think you're queuing on. Would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess it's kind of a genre of technical writing that's out there on the web. Like when platforms like Amazon and Slack and like Dropbox, lots of these platforms, whenever they have an outage of some kind, they'll often publish, I guess they get called postmortems a lot of the time, but it strikes me that there's a lot of similarity in sort of like incident response in the description of what happened and why that they share, and your insight into like how important trust is to these networks, sharing this information. It strikes me that trust is a big reason why these platforms choose to share that information in this particular way. But I don't know. Maybe that's all there is to be said, or it feels like maybe something. I was just curious if you have any research or people looking at this genre of work.
Yeah, I haven't really looked at it in a focused way. I think it's a really good point. It's very clear that these postmortems, they're partly about generating trust, but also sometimes about generating, I guess these are closely related things, generating credibility. So, you know, for example, when Kaspersky, maybe it wasn't really a postmortem about Kaspersky's failure, but when they published things about the black energy malware, which many people attribute to Russia, for example, part of what they're trying to say, show the world is, oh yeah, you know, we know you all think this came from Russia. They don't say this, but you can imagine, it's not hard to infer that this is part of what's going on, right? You all think this came from Russia. Really, we're independent from the Russian government, which is why we shouldn't be blacklisted from US products. And to prove it, we'll stand up and analyze this malware for everybody to see. So it's publicly shared information with a self-interested motive, generate that credibility with the international community.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ed, for the clarification, and Rebecca for the answer. There was a question here that touched on both from your paper and the presentation you had here. Nancy asks, why was the information standard made so complicated as to defeat the purpose?
I think it's one of those things where you get too many cooks in the kitchen and everybody wants something a little different and nobody wants to alienate anybody. And so there was the philosophy of the person, and it ended up being a US person who was more or less in charge of the committee, a couple of US people primarily in charge of the committee that was developing this thing with the IETF. They sort of had, you know, everything in the kitchen sink approach to developing the standards. So if any country in any part of the world wanted something, they just sort of said, sure, partly as a way of getting buy-in, but then it had this counterproductive effect as well. So it's one of those tensions of, you know, you want to have more people involved and want to have more buy-in from more countries, but then that means that people don't, it's really hard to get convergence on exactly how something's going to operate. And if you look at examples of really successful standards, and I think generally, I'm sort of just talking off the top of my head, so people can contradict me if you think this is wrong. My impression is that often they're developed by a very small team. And then it just so happens that people, and so they're very focused, they're very tightly defined. And then everybody in the world decides this is useful. And so it's sort of, once you get a certain scale of use, it becomes de facto a global standard. but I'm not sure how many standards are really developed with global buy-in from the beginning. And I'm talking off the top of my head here. So people who've studied standards development, if that's wrong, tell me that. But that's my intuition, just thinking about the standard, like TCP/IP was not developed. I mean, it's been modified by an international community, but it sort of started in a much more, with a much more focused community developing it. And then there were arguments about whether it should be accepted or whether another standard should be accepted, and it won. It's sort of, in many respects, it won.
Great. Wayne asks or says, engaging history, many thanks. I'm interested in the complex, quote, competitive collaboration, end quote, arrangements at play in these coordination processes, specifically how governments, quote, play differently than commercial players. For example, did these differences surface in specific negotiations around shared data formats like IODEF becoming more global?
That's a good question. When I was looking at, I could go back and look, I didn't see, when we were looking through the record, so all the meeting minutes, this research was based on looking through all the meeting minutes for all the standard development over, 7 years, and seeing what was discussed. And a lot of it was really tedious. It wasn't really obvious that commercial teams and governments were pushing for different things in the standard. It could be, I don't know if there was something in particular that the person asking this question had in mind in terms of what they might prefer to do differently. But it wasn't obvious to me that there were like clear differences, that the commercial sector wanted the standard to look one way and the governments wanted it to look a different way.
Okay. Wayne, if you wanted to expand on that or clarify, just give me a signal in the chat or something. Oh, looks like Sarah's opened your mic up.
Hey, hi, thank you.
Hi.
In many ways, you addressed that when you talked about Kaspersky versus the Russian government and how they are both related and distinctly separate, and how they're presenting that in various negotiation settings. So in some ways, that's what I was looking at was, are there distinct differences when the US and China are going at something when it's Google versus Baidu going at something?
Oh yeah, yeah, I was thinking primarily in the context of standard development. And I don't think I've seen it in the context of standard development. But certainly, I mean, the interests, if it's just up to the companies, they probably aren't going to worry that much about national security, right? They're going to be like, this Chinese company is giving, Huawei is producing things at a really good price, so we'll go ahead and do it. And then the US government steps in and says, no, we don't trust the arrangements between Huawei and China. And so, yeah, I think when you look at cooperation on certainly exchange of technology, and I will also say that governments have started to make it more difficult for first to operate. So this was an interesting paper. I've never had this happen with the paper before. It was gratifying in a way, but before it was published, I'd sent the draft around to people in the incident response community. And I got a note from the executive director of FIRST saying, we'd like to use pieces of your paper, which had not yet been published, for our discussions with the Department of Homeland Security and the US government, because they're trying to restrict us from allowing certain people to be in our network, and saying that basically the kinds of information that we will exchange within FIRST could basically violate export control laws in the US with respect to certain kinds of information. And so it was a little bit awkward because, well, the paper hasn't been published yet, and I really don't want it to, once it's published, then you can't publish it. But if it appears online, then I've got copyright issues. Anyway, we actually moved the publication forward by about 7 months so that it would be less of an issue. And I basically rewrote a section of the paper for them to use, and they did. I don't know if they were successful, but that's an example of how the US government and other governments have definitely sort of clamped down, I think, recently on some of this cooperation, because, and that means cooperation between the private sector as well as the governmental teams. And it was a tough sell from the very beginning, people tell me, trying to explain to the US government why they should fund the US CERT team or the CERT coordinating center should be funded to go teach the Russians how to do incident response. And they were trying to say, no, this actually is in the best interest of national security. And the US government was like, what, really? And what I heard from the people who were involved with this is that they were generally successful actually in persuading the powers that be in the US government to allow this kind of work, but that it was work. And that work came from very much from the bottom up, from these technical people who were saying, we need to have partners in these other countries and we want them to be competent partners. We'd rather have some cooperation than no cooperation, even if we know we can't completely trust people on the other side. And one more thing I'll say, sorry, I do want to get to other questions. I did ask the person who's in charge of the Trusted Introducer Service, is there a difference between how you treat people who have been in the Trusted Introducer that are from Western Europe and say people from Russia? And he said, you'd only trust them so far as you can throw them. So just because you've been vetted by Trusted Introducer, that only gets you to a certain threshold of trust. And so there's, even the private actors sort of have that constant awareness that, it's nice that maybe they can cooperate on certain kinds of crime and certain kinds of malware with these other countries, but that if the Russian government gets involved, it's not so clear that they're going to get that cooperation from any private or public team in Russia.
Great.
That kind of addressed the question. Well, I didn't really speak to the issue of standard development, but yeah, differences between government run certs and privately run certs are definitely evident, I think.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And we'll have another question about some of the cert stuff further on. We do have a list of questions here, but any of them that we don't get a chance to, I'll see if Dr. Slayton is willing to answer offline, and we can email everybody afterwards if you didn't get a chance to get your questions answered. This one comes from James. Hi, Rebecca. James Shires here in Leiden. Great talk and love the maintenance framing. You touch on Edgerton's point on inequality and maintenance, and it comes up tangentially in your talk in the creation of the AP cert. Can you expand on this? E.g., the patch infrastructure is global, but implementation is still dependent on local context, whether you have enabled automatic updates. So maybe maintenance is global? Smile.
Global. I like it. I think that's true. I think that's a very important point, is that even like this global infrastructure of Microsoft's patches, it's not truly, it's not universal. It's global in the sense that it actually does reach to many places all around the world. But there's definitely people who are left and organizations that are left out of that, simply just because they're running obsolete stuff, and Microsoft decides, well, we're not going to maintain that anymore. And if you're in a poorer country, you're probably going to be more likely to run that obsolete stuff, and that's going to make you vulnerable to hackers. So yeah, those inequalities definitely persist. One of the things that's interesting about this space that I found very early in the research, beginning in it's probably the early 2000s, governments recognized though that they were still vulnerable to the vulnerabilities in these poorer countries. Those vulnerabilities came back to bite. And so that's one of the reasons that you see regional organizations like APEC in the Asia Pacific region funding training for CSIRTs in South America, in all parts of the world, including with countries that they wouldn't necessarily have thought of themselves as being tightly connected to, because they recognize that those are particularly vulnerable because of those local inequalities. So that recognition of the inequalities partly drives investment in training infrastructure, for example. So there's curriculums that are developed to sort of be put around the world to help train teams around the world. But of course, the inequalities persist. Even if you train people, if they're still dealing with obsolete hardware that isn't supported, yeah, you're still out of the global network because of that as well. One other thing I can say about that, just really briefly, this also becomes sort of a political selling point with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. And then as the internet becomes more available in Eastern European countries, which previously had been barred from actually getting certain kinds of networking technologies because of US export control laws. Once the Soviet Union dissolves, they start to get these technologies. The European incident response community recognizes that certain regional organizations like NATO have an interest in drawing these poorer countries that have less experience into Western Europe. And therefore, the incident response community, this again is very bottom up. It's not that NATO decides to do this. The incident response teams talk to each other and say, you know, I bet that if we talk to NATO, we can convince them that it is in sort of the Western European security interests to fund training in Romania, in these other parts of Europe, Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, in order to bring them into the Western European fold. So those inequalities themselves become a resource for gaining, or become sort of a leverage point for gaining resources to build out this infrastructure.
Great. Julie asks, based on your historical understanding of these teams, what's the right direction they seem to be going in for the near future? And is this, in your opinion, the quote, right direction?
So direction in terms, can I ask for a little more specificity? Direction in terms of whether we should share more, whether we should build better infrastructure.
Sarah, can you unmute Julie? While we're waiting, oh, there she comes. Julie, you can go ahead and unmute and ask.
Hi, Julie.
Julie, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I think I needed to click one additional thing. So when I remember direction, so as far as like some of the models, like the sharing models, do you see any changes happening in the near future? Are there certain conditions that are necessitating a change in the way they do business and the way that they share? Just those types of observations, like what, like the current environment that we're in and possibly the near future environment, what's going to kind of be that catalyst to force them in a different direction or to change and adapt?
Okay, I think I'm seeing what you're getting at now. Yeah, I think that's a great question. So first of all, I'm primarily a historian, so I'm terrible at projecting into the future and generally try to avoid it. That's a great way to make a fool of myself. 10 years hence, people can look back and say, look what she said. But my sense is, from just talking to people, is that there is more and more pressure on these teams not to work together because of increased security concerns, national security concerns. Now, I think that could change, you know, I suspect that it's changed just since 2020 to 2021 with the new presidential administration in the US. I would guess that, again, this is conjectural, I haven't asked, but I would guess that the current administration and Homeland Security offices are going to be more receptive to this idea that cooperation is a good thing and should be allowed. So FIRST actually had to basically remove a couple of teams from its membership. It had to suspend their membership. And it wasn't because they had done anything wrong, it was because of legal concerns with the US government coming to them and saying, if you continue sharing information or keep these people in your network, you could be in violation of export control laws. So that could change, of course, with a presidential administration or with other political wins. You can also see it going the other way, though. You know, although our current presidential administration is much more interested in cooperation and sort of building international bridges than the Trump administration. You know, you could see a major security incident really reversing that pretty quickly. So this is a really interesting space because on the one hand, so much of the initiative really does come from non-state actors. It comes from technical people or people in the private sector who want to get certain things done, and they know that they have to work on an international scale to get those things done. But the governments still have a lot of power to prevent the kind of cooperation that that needs to happen. So I think the jury's out in terms of what's going to happen in the future. What I can say is that in the last, I'd say 4 to 5 years, and I don't think this is just the US that's caused this, but the US is certainly one of the actors, there has been more and more pushback against really broadening cooperation and sharing because of mistrust about, you know, national security issues.
Great, thank you. So we're up on the 3 o'clock hour and respect everybody's time. I do have a question I'll ask, but I'll hold it for now. Any other questions, we'll see if we can get answered and responded later. But I do want to let everybody know that our speaker next month will be Dr. Jason Nurse from the University of Kent, who will be talking about a playbook for effective corporate communications after cybersecurity incidents. That's going to be on Wednesday, April 21st at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. And then the time TBD, we're going to have Dr. Kevin Fu from the University of Michigan, who's also now an acting director at the FDA, as our May speaker on May 13th, where we're going to be having a fireside chat style, our first one in that format, where we're going to be talking about introducing socio-technical perspectives into the embedded securities of medical devices and things of that nature. So that's what we have coming up, closing out the spring. Otherwise, let's have everybody thank Dr. Rebecca Slayton for her time here. And for those of you coming to the small group chat afterwards, we look forward to seeing you there. And thank you everybody for attending today.